do you think of when you think of a female detective? Maybe it's Helen Mirren playing DCI Jane Tennyson in Prime Suspect, or Millie Bobby Brown playing Enola Holmes, or Kate Winslet playing Mayor of Easttown. Of course, these are actresses playing detectives. But what if an actress became a real detective? In the Victorian period, there were several women who did exactly that. One of them was called Kate EASTON, and she lived here in Great Russell Street in Bloomsbury, near to the British Museum. Kate EASTON was born in 1856, and she was a character, larger than life, assertive, with a great sense of humour. Many of the skills she learned on the stage would prove immensely valuable when she entered upon her new role as Kate EASTON, the lady detective who knows no fear and can shoot straight, as one newspaper put it. Kate was born into a theatrical family. Her parents were working class. Her father was a waterman, began his life rowing people across the Thames, but he became a stage doorkeeper. Her brother was a musician and a professional music teacher, and her niece was called Madeleine Lucette. She was quite a famous actress and playwright of the Victorian period, some of whose plays contained detective characters. So Kate wouldn't have faced any opposition in becoming an actress and vocalist, as the censuses proclaim her to be. We know that as a teenager, she acted in a restoration comedy at the Charing Cross Theatre. She would have been acting and dancing in this version of John Vanbrugh's The Relapse. And her character encouraged a roguish male to cheat on his wife. It's a play about adultery. Ironically, as a female detective, adultery would remain one of Kate EASTON's specialties. But in her new role, she'd often be pursuing an errant spouse, gathering evidence for her client to obtain a divorce. When the acting parts started to dry up, Kate EASTON was able to repurpose her theatrical skills for shadowing suspects, interviewing people without breaking character, and gaining access to buildings that would normally be forbidden. Many Victorian women worked for private inquiry agencies as detectives. Why? Well, actually, as women, they had an advantage. Domestic servants were ubiquitous in Victorian life, and it was easier to place a woman as a cook, as a governess, or a housemaid in a household where secrets were suspected. Bigamy, blackmail, corporate embezzlement, political dirty tricks, all of these formed part of the Victorian female detective's caseload. Kate EASTON was unusual because she ran her own agency. Its buildings were here in Shaftesbury Avenue. These are offices which are still used as rehearsal rooms for plays. Kate employed male and female detectives, and she used what she'd learned on stage to project an attention-grabbing persona that she used in public advertisements. For Victorians, consulting a private inquiry agent was often an embarrassing thing. It meant an admission of suspicion, often in your private life. So it must have been especially reassuring for female clients to know that they could consult with a female detective in private. Kate said that her offices were open night and day, and she could consult on anything of a confidential nature. For a Victorian audience, the female detective was an agony aunt with a gun. It was a powerful lure. What kind of cases did Kate EASTON solve? Well, from her own account, she was especially gifted at finding missing persons. To give an example, a mother came to her distraught that her only daughter had disappeared. She feared foul play. Kate managed to return the daughter within 24 hours. She and a friend had gone away with two married men well known in London. This foolish sexcapade was swiftly stopped. You can imagine the mother's inexpressible relief. Not all heroes were Kate. But not all the Victorian female detectives' exploits were heroic. Indeed, in this morally murky world, some of Kate Easton's cases were quite distasteful. For example, the case of Violet Wigglesworth, where Francis Wigglesworth employed Kate Easton to spy on his wife here at 38 Ennismore Avenue in Chiswick. The Wigglesworths were married in 1901 in Dublin. He was a company director. She also came from a manufacturing family. They had a little boy, Frank, in 1903, but by 1906 the marriage had fallen apart and they agreed to live separately. 2 years later, however, Francis Wigglesworth wanted a divorce, and in order to get a divorce he had to gain evidence of his wife's adultery. At first, he employs a male detective, W. James of Fulham, but W. James fails to get the goods. So at that point, Mr. Wigglesworth turns to Kate Easton, and Kate Easton is clever. She manages to get her female employee, Mrs. Bardrick, alias Mrs. Bland, into 38 Ennismore Avenue. How? Because she poses as a female lodger, and Violet Wigglesworth, doubtless welcoming somebody to share the costs, somebody to share her company, welcomes her in. In fact, ironically, she even invites Mrs. Bland into her bedroom and says, look at this, here's a letter from W. James of Fulham. It says my husband is going to employ a female detective to look at me, and if I spot her, then I should get one of my gentleman friends to chuck her out. And Mrs. Bland doubtless says, oh dear, that sounds dreadful, what a horrible thing. It sounds as if Violet Wigglesworth was enjoying herself. She also told Mrs. Bland that the list of co-respondents, i.e. men she had slept with, would stretch all the way from Chiswick to Lancaster Gate. But the point is that the law was unfair to Victorian women in that men could divorce their wives for adultery alone, whereas women had to prove adultery aggravated by cruelty or desertion or bigamy or other things. So Francis Wigglesworth was very well placed to get a cost-free divorce. And indeed he did, thanks to Kate Easton and her cleverness. It just goes to show that the Victorian female detective was not always on the side of her fellow women. In a period where the law was stacked against women, sometimes she was on the wrong side of history. Sometimes, though, Kate Easton did use her skills on behalf of her fellow women. In 1913, for example, in Bath, she investigated an assault against Miss Edith Wheelwright, who was a prominent suffragette and women's leader. First, it looked like a mugging. It had happened in the dark and Miss Wheelwright's ring had been stolen. But Kate Easton discovered that, in fact, the assailant was another woman, Emily Manning, who wanted to frighten Miss Wheelwright out of Bath, presumably because she didn't agree with her views. Kate Easton lived to the ripe old age of 75. She died after a fall down these steps in front of her front door, 20 Arundel Gardens in Notting Hill, in which she sustained a fractured femur. She'd always lied about her age in the census, knocking off a decade or so. And the newspapers on her death reported that she had died at the age of 55. So she may have lost her life, but she knocked off a couple of decades as she fell. Kate Easton was a pioneer, a shapeshifter, and an entrepreneur. Rejecting marriage, children, and the conventional responsibilities of Victorian womanhood, she staged her life and lived her persona to the full, becoming one of the best known and most successful of detectives in London at the turn of the century.